Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Dull is the eye that will not weep to see, thy walls defaced, thy mouldering shrines removed by British hands, which it had best behoved to guard those relics ne'er to be restored. Cursed be the hour from their isle they roved, and once again thy hapless bosom gored, and snatched shrinking goods to northern climes abhorred. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hocton. I'm a public historian, author and broadcaster. That was The Curse of Minerva, one of the satirical poems of Lord Byron, and it was written in Athens in March 1807 during his first visit to Greece. And he actually wrote it as he sat in the Acropolis with his back to one of the marble pillars as the gods of ancient Greece appeared to him. And of course, it's about the removal of the marble frieze, the carved figures that run right along the outside of the top of the Parthenon on the Acropolis that sits above Athens. Just thinking about Byron's poem, it's amazing the way they wrote in those days. Thankfully, they didn't talk that way. Otherwise, if we were transported back in time, we would never be able to get around or understand a simple word that they were saying. But what Byron was basically alluding to in The Curse of Minerva is that it was an absolute abhorrent thing that Lord Elgin did by removing the actual frieze itself. And this is what we're going to talk about today. The Elgin Marbles, because they're in the news and they have been for over 200 years. That poem was actually printed in England for private circulation only, but it was pirated and read extensively in the United States, where Byron was actually quite popular, and it crossed the Atlantic back again to England. Byron actually refused to authorize any publication because he probably wanted to go back and live in England, and what he was effectively doing was criticizing the British aristocracy, of which he was actually a part of. The poem consists of 312 lines, and it's quite a severe attack against the British ambassador to Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire, Lord Elgin, and his taking away from Greece the so-called Elgin Marbles, or as they've come to be known, the Parthenon Marbles. So I first saw the marbles when I was about 9 on a school trip to the British Museum. And they're not just boring old sculptures, and they're definitely not marbles. I know people think when you say the Elgin Marbles that they're actually, Greek marbles, but they're actually not. They're marble, and there's lots of them. So there's marbles. There's over 200 of them. And they're really, even as a 9-year-old, I was quite astounded by how beautiful they actually are. And of course, I was into comics. Comics were a big part of my life as a kid and certainly growing up. The sculptures themselves are actually sculptures of superheroes of the past. I think that's the best way to describe them. They are gods and goddesses, and, they're all these epic heroes doing amazing things, made by a sculptor whose name should be famous. I mean, I know it is in Greece, but he should be famous worldwide. His name was Phidias, and it's time that we started talking about him because he was a master carver at the time, and this is actually a time machine. The Elgin Marbles are a time machine that actually takes you back to ancient Greece. So a little bit of history for you. Greece in 1900, like much of Southeast Europe, was actually incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. So they were the legal authority of the time, so effectively Turkey. And Lord Elgin always claimed that he had permission to take away the marble structures of the Parthenon frieze, given permission by the Turkish. Ironically, the Turkish and English copy of that contract has mysteriously been lost, and the marbles remain a disputed fact to this day. So in 2022, the Greek culture minister accused Elgin of a blatant act of serial theft. The Elgin marbles actually went through quite a lot when they were taken down. Keep in mind that the Parthenon was built in the 5th century BC, and they were actually craned down from the Parthenon and transported back to England by ships. And there's also talk of the curse of Minerva ever since Byron's poem came out. And of course, one of those ships on the way back sank. The Greeks at the time argued that it was an act of the god of the sea, Poseidon. Those marbles were recovered. There was a subsea recovery operation put into place, one of the first ones that was ever done by the British government, and they were brought back to England. Through various means, and I won't go into the whole story about Lord Elgin because I don't think he's that interesting a character to talk about. But when he came back, his wife decided that she would sue him for divorce, and he was very promptly broke. The marbles actually cost him a vast fortune to bring back, millions and millions and millions of pounds. And of course, then she sued for divorce. And Elgin then decided to sell the marbles to the British Museum for effectively half the cost of what he paid to get them back. And that's where they have remained to this day. Well, actual fact, he sold them to the British government, and the British government then gave them to the museum. So that's how they belong to the British Museum. When Greece became independent, however, in 1830, thanks in part to a crushing British and French naval victory over the Turks, the newly formed Greek government actually asked the United Kingdom to return the marbles. The request was refused, as has every other request in the subsequent 200 years since their removal. But UNESCO, the World Heritage Organization, is now on their case too. So that's going to be an interesting one to follow as we move forward. The Elgin marbles were actually brought by the British government, as I said, and they're housed in the British Museum. But then the question rises, well, the question that I was thinking of when I was researching this podcast is, who actually owns them? So after a little bit of research and a phone call through to the British Museum, it turns out the museum is a non-departmental public body which is actually sponsored by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport through a renewable 3-year funding agreement. However, the artifacts at the British Museum, all of them, are actually owned by the museum itself, which is a public institution and therefore belongs to the people of the United Kingdom. And get this, the museum's collection, I mean, has anybody listening to this not been there? It is the most amazing museum. And I was actually very fortunate this year. I was very fortunate this year to be given private access to the museum, where a friend of mine opened it up for me first thing in the morning, and I was allowed to wander at will. But get this, the museum collection actually includes over 8 million objects from all parts of the world. And it actually spans, if you collectively add those objects together, it spans over 2 million years of human history. Isn't that amazing? So the question then arises, should they be given back? Not everything, just the Elgin marbles. The marbles themselves were actually created at the height of the Athenian Empire, which was a place bursting with confidence and energy and wealth and, all that imperial swagger. Perhaps not coincidentally, they were taken by Lord Elgin to London when London was actually hitting its height as well. Greece by that stage had, very much gone into, disrepair and disarray. And London was absolutely steaming ahead. So it's interesting that he bought them at that time and took them there. So a little bit on Lord Elgin. As I said, I don't want to talk about him a lot. But he deserves a mention in so much that I think he's actually saved the marbles so that we can actually appreciate them today. There's a big argument that goes up, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, and I don't want to reiterate that had he not saved them, the Turks or the Germans, during the Turkish War of 1812 to Greek independence, or the First World War that started in 1914, that they would have been destroyed. Maybe, maybe not. We'll actually never know. But what we do know is that Lord Elgin saved them, and that's why we can see them today. He was actually a very distinguished diplomat and a patron of the arts before he went to Constantinople as ambassador in 1799, which was just after the Battle of the Nile. And it was at this stage that England actually came into great favor with Turkey. Lord Elgin actually then asked the Sultan's permission to ship to England any piece of statue from the occupied territory of Greece that he came across, and the Sultan agreed. So was it Lord Elgin's fault, or can you blame the Turks for this? I kid, of course. Elgin was actually a member of a group of English aristocrats who were members of the Society of Dilettante, which was founded for the encouragement of classical archaeology. And I say this very much tongue-in-cheek. The society is actually believed to have been established as a gentleman's club, because these were all being formed, in the 18th century. And this club was actually formed in 1734 by men who had been on the Grand Tour. So men of means who had effectively toured France and notably Italy. Notable members actually included the Right Honourable Sir Joseph Banks, Sir Francis Dashwood, Lord Dundas, Horace Walpole, future Prime Minister, and of course one of the most famous painters of the time, Joshua Reynolds. And it was actually described in the papers of the day as a club for which nominal qualifications were having been to Italy and getting drunk, and not necessarily in that order. However, the ardent ambition was behind all of the above, I think, was to make England the art centre of the world. And keep in mind, these people possessed great political power, and they often held important diplomatic posts in various embassies, such as Lord Elgin. And one of their main concerns was actually to take advantage of the opportunities of their residence abroad and actually enrich their mansions, not museums, mansions back home with artistic spoils of the continent. Elgin therefore used his political mission to the port, I guess, as an opportunity for despoiling Greece of her sculptures, of which he did rather well, I must say. The official defense of Lord Elgin, which I alluded to earlier on, is in a memorandum that was actually published in 1810, was very simple. Had the marbles not been taken away from Greece, they would have been destroyed at some stage by the Turks. The Turks actually destroyed quite a lot. And it's estimated that Elgin actually shipped to England at least 253 pieces of marble of this frieze. Notwithstanding, he also included vases and coins and statues at 2 other times. So to help me out and tell me what's currently going on in Greece and what the Greek government are doing, I'm being joined by Nick Malkoutzis and Georgia Nakou, 2 extremely well-known journalists. They're amazing guys. They are lovers of Greek history, and they are both contributors to Acropolis GR. Nick and Georgia, thank you very much for coming to the podcast. Georgia, if I can start with you, let's do a deep dive into the history. I mean, what are we talking? 5th century BC, Athens, the Enlightenment period for Greek, or what was to become Greece, the Great Building period in Athens. Why was the Parthenon built?
Yes, as you say, Parthenon is a monument that belongs to the 5th century BC. It was built in the latter part of the 5th century, which is commonly referred to as the Golden Age of Athens. And it's the period where democracy came into its own as a system of government, and Athens was rich and powerful. It saw, the fluorescence of Greek drama, great period for the visual arts and so on. The Parthenon is part of the Acropolis complex, and the Acropolis are on top of a hill that overlooks Athens. And the Athens of the 5th century was around the foothills of the Acropolis. The Parthenon itself is a temple to Athena, and Athena was the patron goddess of Athens. But to put it into sort of the more proximate historical context, Athens and many of the other Greek city-states had spent the first half of the 5th century battling the Persians, what is known as the Persian Wars. In around 480 BC, the Persians had actually come into Athens. Athens had been evacuated, and they razed it to the ground twice. In 480, 479 BC, they burnt what was then, at that time, the old temple of Athena. Nothing was left, and this was a great blow to Athens. Once Athens recovered from that, and the Persians were sort of sent back from whence they came, Athens set about rebuilding the monuments and the Acropolis. And so apart from being sort of a religious monument and, what we see now as a temple to democracy, it was very much a monument to Athenian might. I would compare it in present-day terms to the Freedom Tower in New York after 9/11, to bounce back from that blow and show the world that Athens was very much back and bigger and better than ever. Pericles, who was the powerful man at the time, started this building program, which consisted of several buildings on the Acropolis and included the Parthenon. It also, in addition to being a temple, housed the treasury of the Delian League, which was the big coalition of the willing that Athens put together to fight the Persians. So in addition to being a temple and a monument to Athenian might, it was very much to become the seeds of the Athenian Empire. So you could also look at it as a sort of proto-NATO headquarters. Very much sort of Athens is here, Athens is back, Athens is strong.
Okay, that's cool. So maybe a little bit like St. Paul's Cathedral at the end of the troubled 17th century for the English. What about the frieze itself, Georgia? What does it depict? And maybe if you could actually enlighten listeners to what is a frieze, that would be great. And what do we actually have in the British Museum?
The British Museum currently has just over half of the decorative elements of the Parthenon. So the Parthenon is sort of an oblong building with columns, a colonnade surrounding it. And the bits that were the sort of the most interesting sculptural elements were the frieze, the metopes, which are sort of sculpted panels that also go around the top of the columns, and then the pedimental sculptures. And these are the sculptures that were sort of in the gable end of the temple. And they show a series of mythological scenes which show the foundation myth of Athens, starting in sort of deep myth and progressing to, for example, the pedimental sculptures show a series of mythological battles between different groups of mythical creatures, the centaurs and the lapiths and so on. They're all allusions to the history, the deep history of Athens, and they're allegories for the Persian Wars, and Athens is sort of leading the Greek world in a victory against the Persians.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, look, as I said, I visited the Parthenon for the first time probably around 1986. And I actually remember walking inside, and touching the marble and actually sitting down, inside the actual temple itself, marveling at the building and what it would have taken to, construct something like that. And I love Greek history, and I could talk on the subject for ages. But can we come to the point where Elgin gets his hands on the marbles, please? I mean, Greece has been for a very long time under Turkish rule. So what actually happens?
Just sort of quick fast forward, as you say, after the decline of the classical world and after the Romans took over, the Byzantine rule and so on, the importance of Athens as a centre declined. By the time you get to the 19th century, it really was sort of, as they describe it at the time, as a village of a few thousand souls around the base of the Acropolis. The Acropolis itself being quite prominent, had been used at times as a defensive structure. And it had fallen into disrepair, and it had also suffered a few sort of episodes of destruction, including being shelled by the Venetians, which really took big chunks out of it and killed several hundred people at the time. So it was sort of a shadow of its former self, bits of broken statuary lying around, and also it had been sort of looted by the Venetians as well. So there were bits missing. Bits were being used to build other structures around it. There was a mosque on the hill during the Ottoman era in the middle of the classical ruins. And into this sort of steps Lord Elgin. So Lord Elgin his name was Thomas Bruce, and his title was the 7th Earl of Elgin. And he lobbied the crown to become an ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And he succeeded, and he was appointed, I'm going to read this out, Ambassador Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary of His Britannic Majesty to the Sublime Porte of Selim III, the Sultan of Turkey. So Elgin was a bit of a fan of classical Greece, which was not quite as widespread at the turn of the sort of 18th, 19th century as it became afterwards. He was a bit of a dilettante, a bit of a collector of ancient bits of stone, and he was very much looking forward to going to Greece for that reason. Before setting off, he approached politicians at the time and said, would you be interested if I was to take some artists with me and record these monuments to improve the tastes back home? And they very much said, no, sorry, we're not interested. But he persevered. He got there, and he set about doing a bit more than just recording the monuments. Now, there's a lot of debate as to what his motives were. He certainly, obviously, wasn't acting on behalf of the Crown or the British government. He was very much freelancing. Did he intend to bring the pieces back to give to the nation? It's not clear, and many people point to the fact that he was in the process of building his country pile in Scotland at the time. So there's some insinuation that he actually just meant to take the stuff back to scatter around the grounds of Broomhall House. So he got a form of consent to do this. And when we get to it, there's a lot of the debate around the legality of his actions centres around what exactly the Ottomans gave him permission to do and what he actually did, and whether the permission was strong enough to allow him to take it out of the country. He ended up taking 200 crates full of the nicest bits of the decorative elements of the Parthenon and shipping them to Britain over a course of several years. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this haul, he took about 275 feet of frieze, and that's longer than the width of a football pitch. 15 of the metopes and 17 of the pedimental sculptures, plus bits of other parts of the Acropolis, including the caryatid, one of the female maidens holding up the roof of the Erechtheion temple, which is another sort of iconic piece of 5th century Greek sculpture. He got this to the UK at his own expense, paying £75,000 at the time, which is several million pounds in today's money. In the course of getting home, his wife had an affair. They had a very sort of tabloid-style divorce. And Elgin was virtually bankrupted from the combined expense of bringing the sculptures back with him and his costly divorce. So he was more keen than ever to try and sell the artefacts. He made a first attempt to sell them to the British state that fell flat. This was around sort of 1801. He kept battling on at it, and eventually the British Parliament approved the purchase of the sculptures for about half of what he paid to ship them back, and then gave them to the British Museum. Not everyone was enthusiastic about it. Lord Byron was very vocal against it, and so were other travellers who'd been to Greece, but public opinion was fairly split on the matter, and there had to be a parliamentary inquiry to approve the purchase. It wasn't until the sculptures went on display in the British Museum that they actually became wildly popular, even amongst Byron's contemporaries, and arguably sort of helped raise awareness around the cause of the Greek Revolution, which started in 1821. So that's how they came to be from Athens to London.
Okay, thanks, Georgia. I mean, that was a complete tour de force. So, and where do the rumours of the Curse of Minerva come from? I mean, obviously due to Elgin's bad luck. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Orthodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Orthodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. But Nick, if I can come to you on this, the Greek Revolution, with its great surge in nationalism, which resulted in Greek independence, when did the Parthenon Marbles, and I'll call them the Parthenon Marbles because I think it's a little bit disingenuous to use Elgin's name, become an issue with the Greek people?
Well, the first official request from the fledgling Greek state was made in 1842, the first request for the marbles to return to Greece. A new state has all kinds of issues to sort out. But the campaign as we know it today, and perhaps your listeners have seen videos online or posters on the tube or wherever it may be about international campaign to bring them home, bring them back, that really started in 1982. What kicked it off? There were a number of factors. Firstly, at that point, the Parthenon was really suffering, not just from the ravages of time, but also the ravages of pollution in Athens. Obviously, at that time, Athens was very well known for this cloud of pollution, the nephos, as it was called in Greek, that hung over the city, and it was really eating away at the sculptures that remained. So at that point, this effort began to preserve and protect the Parthenon, the Acropolis in general. And this coincided with a political change in Greece. A new socialist government had just come to power in 1981. The PASOK party won the elections. And this came after a very troubled period in Greek history, where we had a 7-year military dictatorship in the late 60s and mid-70s. And this government wanted to represent a newer, freer, more progressive Greece, but obviously wanted to kind of make this reconnection with the ancient world, which is always a dynamic going on in Greece, in modern Greece, this kind of connection with the past, especially the ancient past, and as we just mentioned, was so instrumental in the support of the international community for the Greek War of Independence. But we also had Greece in 1981 joining what was then the European Economic Community, the EC, today the EU, and it was very much about Greece trying to establish its place in the world, in the Western world. And this idea of bringing the marbles back was really part of this effort to show a new face, to show a Greece that had a very bright and illustrious history, but one which had a relevant present and promising future as well. And that's when it all started. And the woman who launched that campaign was Melina Mercouri. She was a culture minister. She had been an actress, and perhaps some of your listeners might know her from what was then a very emblematic film, Never on Sunday. People may know the tune to that. She acted in that, became an international celebrity, which for Greece at that time in the late 50s, early 60s really didn't have a lot of international celebrities. So she was a nationwide figure, popular with Greeks at home, popular with Greeks abroad, but also known to an international audience. And in 82, she went to a UNESCO conference in Mexico and said, look, we're beginning this campaign to get them back. And as she put it, for the marbles to come back under the blue sky of Attica, Attica being the sort of greater Athens region. And she talked about them returning to their natural space and being reunited as part of a unique whole. And this was really the basis of the campaign was, and it's still relevant today, was that, yes, artifacts have been taken from many countries, but we're not talking about a vase that's been taken or a statue. This is a unique sculpture which was broken down into pieces, and part of it is in the UK and part of it is here, and we want to reunite it. It's not about just bringing something back home. We want to reunite this work of art, essentially. And you asked earlier about what bits are here, what bits are in the UK. You can sum it up by saying the head of Athena is here in the Acropolis Museum, and her torso is in the British Museum.
Okay, fantastic. So what's the current situation? Has there been any movement at all?
Well, the progress has been limited. Obviously, the marbles are still in the UK. I think there have been various small gains along the way. There was a time when the world would have spoken of the Elgin marbles. Today, it's more likely that we speak of the Parthenon marbles, and that's a result of this campaign of awareness. When Melina Mercouri began this effort to get the marbles back in 82, it also marked the start of these international committees for the marbles return being formed around the world, including in the UK. And they are really the ones that drive it outside of a sort of government-to-government discussion. The Greek government at various times has made the argument, and it's been pushed back. Initially, the argument was that they're better looked after in the British Museum. Athens is a dirty, polluted city. They're just going to be damaged in the dirty environment there. Then there was the argument that, well, you don't really have a proper museum because at the time, until 2009, Greece didn't have a large dedicated Acropolis museum. There was, I wouldn't call it quite a porter cabin, but there was this very small museum on the actual Acropolis rock. So we had this push just before Athens hosted the Olympics in 2004 to get them back. And that fell flat on its face when the then Greek Prime Minister, Kostas Simitis, sidled up to the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, at the sidelines of a EU summit. And he didn't realise that the microphones were picking up what they were talking about. And he said to Tony Blair, this was in 2003, look, we've got the Olympics coming up next year. But I also have elections. It would be really useful for me to get the marbles back. And this caused a big furore in Greece. It was a political scandal that we're trying to politicize this issue when it's really a national issue, an issue of national importance. And of course, he didn't get anything out of Tony Blair. But the interesting thing is that Greece has seen Labour leaders, if not necessarily the Prime Minister in this case, as more receptive to the idea than Conservative leaders of the marbles coming back. So Tony Blair's predecessors, Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock, both publicly came out more or less in favour of returning the marbles. And more recently, Jeremy Corbyn gave an interview to Tanea newspaper and our colleague Yannis Andritropoulos, who's their London correspondent, and said, yes, I'll give them back if I become Prime Minister.
Right.
But of course, it's not as simple as that. They are the property of the British Museum, and it's up to the trustees of the museum to decide this. But even then, as I understand it, it would need a change to the law in the UK, a law in the 1960s.
The 1963 British Museum Act, which is intended to preserve the collection for posterity.
Yeah.
So there is a political hurdle to overcome, even if the trustees decided they were keen on repatriating them. The law would have to change to allow them to do that.
Okay, I mean, that's interesting, Georgia. So it is the trustees of the British Museum who have the final say. And that's actually how I understood the bylaws. But if it also requires a change in law itself, then that's not quite true, is it? They actually don't have the final say because there has to be an agreement elsewhere.
Yes, and this is sort of convenient for both the government and the British Museum because it avoids anyone having to make a tough decision on this front. It's very legalistic, and I think it's interesting that there was a letter made the papers recently from a former UK ambassador to Athens who said that really the UK should avoid, or British authorities should avoid falling back on these arguments because they're very transparent and they sort of don't make the UK look as if it's acting in good faith, or the BM.
Do we know how the trustees of the British Museum actually feel about the issue? Because my sense is that they will never release them. Like it's a symbol of Britain's power and dominance, over Greece at the time, which of course means nothing at this stage in history. But if they do release the marbles, then the floodgates are open, literally, for every country in the world to ask for the restitution of their artifacts. And keep in mind, it's not just the British Museum. Once a museum of that standing makes that precedent, every single museum around the world is open for the same attack.
They don't publish their individual views. There's a couple of sort of interesting developments just around this general area. I mean, one is that there is a greater movement generally towards restitution of cultural property. If you look beyond Athens and beyond Greece, there are obviously other countries whose antiquities make up the British Museum's collection, and that is, what is promoted as the great strength of the British Museum, that it holds treasures from around the world. The issue with that is that at the moment, that's come to be seen as a bit of a weakness, because it really exposes the colonial history of Britain and aspects of the colonial history that are less of a cause for pride. For instance, the slave trade. Just to give you a sort of an example that is completely separate from the marbles, but quite relevant, there's a group of artifacts called the Benin bronzes that are scattered around the world, several in the BM, the Metropolitan Museum, and so on. They were looted from the Kingdom of Benin, which is now modern-day Nigeria. They were looted as part of a sort of destruction of the kingdom to do with retaliation over the slave trade. Because of those associations, there's been a pressure on the institutions that hold them to give them back. slightly more clear-cut case because of the circumstances of their taking. But several institutions have voluntarily given them back, not for legalistic reasons, but simply because it's not a good look anymore to show these things away from their context and to potentially sort of hide their context. Because of the way that the argument for the reunification of the Parthenon marbles has been presented in the past, i.e. it's exceptional, it's a one of a kind, it's not like any of these other things, they have sort of isolated themselves from this movement, but it is sort of a sign of a turning tide that may eventually help to, lead to their restitution.
As I said, it could lead to the floodgates on, artifacts being returned. Okay, guys, I'm going to ask you the big question, and I'll start with you, Georgia, if I may. What's the answer? What's the way out of this?
I think the tide is turning on this, but I think it's not going to be easy. I mean, any kind of resolution would have to involve a win-win, diplomatically negotiated solution. The British Museum is unlikely to just return the sculptures to Athens because they have long argued that this would open the floodgates to all sorts of requests. I would argue that, slowly the floodgates are being prized open, but this would be a big one. I mean, it's an existential threat to the British Museum as it stands currently. And someone really sort of radical would have to come in and reconceive the museum for the modern era. The other thing I'd say is that the current British government might have to change before any great moves take place. There was some pretty trenchant rhetoric that greeted George Osborne's appointment to chair the Board of Trustees from groups of Tory backbenchers who basically wrote an open letter calling him not to give in to the so-called woke agenda, which would involve entering into negotiations over things like the Parthenon marbles and even smaller scale restitutions. I don't have a very strong view on what should happen because I think for the purposes of scientific study, they can be anywhere. I think the moral case is to return them to Greece. And I think there are many ways in which you can go about plugging the gap. We have all sorts of technology at our fingertips now. Microsoft just did an augmented reality reconstruction of the whole site at Olympia. Not a very tasteful one, but that's a matter of taste, not technological ability. So I think, more and more moving towards these technological solutions that will make it less painful to part with things. And then there are also things like, I think the Greek governments sort of turn more towards offering things in exchange. So not permanent, but sort of a rolling kind of sequence of loans to museums. So imagine something like the Tutankhamun exhibit, but with Agamemnon's mask and the Mycenae treasures. There's all sorts of things that can happen if museums can sort of work together that way. Make things more interesting for everyone, really.
Okay, thank you for that. Nick, your thoughts?
Speaking as someone who loves the British Museum, and obviously I have a great deal of time for the Acropolis Museum, I want to see them both flourish, and I understand this is a difficult issue in that respect. But also as someone born to Greek parents in the UK and now living in Greece for many years, I've kind of grown a bit tired of this issue always seeming to dominate, at least on the surface, relations between the two countries, when there's so much that's interesting and diverse and progressive and really fantastic about what's going on. Obviously, this is a story that attracts a lot of media attention. It's sexy, people write about it and so on, but it's not anything to do with the current relationship between the two countries and the peoples within the two countries. So I would love to see it resolved. And I would like to go to a quote by the British Museum director, Hartwig Fischer, when he gave an interview to Ta Nea newspaper, a Greek daily newspaper I mentioned before, in 2019. And he essentially suggested that maybe we should appreciate Lord Elgin's act. And his argument, and I quote here, and I'll give my comment on the end, "You could, of course, be saddened by the fact that the original environment has disappeared. When you move a cultural heritage to a museum, you move it outside its original environment. However," he says, this shifting is also a creative act. Now, you can imagine how that went down in Greece.
Like a lead balloon, I would imagine.
Lead balloon would be, to put it mildly. But if he's talking about the creative act, and I won't comment on that, but maybe it's time for another creative act so many years after Lord Elgin's one, if we're going to call it that. I think there are solutions, and the Greek government, not just this one, but previous ones, have tried to be constructive, and I think as time has gone on, perhaps be more constructive in this debate. And they've offered to, in return for getting the marbles back, to send on this sort of rotation important ancient Greek artifacts to be exhibited at the British Museum. So maybe that's a starting point for a sensible adult discussion about this.
That's a good idea, but it's a complex issue. I mean, I love the Parthenon marbles, but I have to say that I would actually take rotating gifts of the best of what Greece has to offer any day of the week. I mean, that's a great deal.
Well, someone made the point of discussing that the BM could actually charge for admission to rotating exhibits, whereas it can't make any revenues off the Parthenon marbles.
Okay. Yeah, another great alternative.
You know, my son, he's 13 now, but when he was about 7 or 8, and obviously they taught about this in Greek school, that Elgin came along and ripped half the marbles off the Parthenon. He suggested to me we take his grandfather's pickup truck, drive it to London, break into the museum, steal the marbles and bring them back. So,
Heist movie idea.
Ooh, I love that. Guys, thank you so much. That was actually very interesting. And thank you both for coming on the show. Folks, this is the last show before Christmas. So I'm playing with the idea of actually producing something next Wednesday. So in between Christmas and New Year. I'm not too sure if I'm going to. But what I will do now is wish you all a very Merry Christmas. It's been an absolute pleasure putting this together and presenting to you this year. If I don't speak to you between now and 2024, have an incredible Christmas and holiday season, and I'll look forward to speaking to you in the new year. But as I said, I may decide to put something out next week. So just in case, keep your eyes open. But if not, Merry Christmas, everyone, and a very happy, healthy, lucky new year for everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.